this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, it wasn't the Germans who first uprooted Stanislaw Kulik and his family. It was the Russians. Deported to a Siberian Gulag, Stanislav's fate took a dramatic turn in 1941 when the Germans launched their invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the Russians released their Polish captives and Stanislav embarked on an arduous journey across thousands of miles. He eventually joined the Polish army in Uzbekistan, a path that would lead him to Britain and ultimately to the front lines in Holland, where he fought with the Polish Parachute Brigade at Arnhem. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me today is Nicholas Kinloch, the grandson of Stanislaw Kulik. Nicholas has chronicled his grandfather's extraordinary wartime experience in his book, From the Soviet Gulag to Arnhem, a Polish paratrooper's epic wartime journey. Nicholas, let's start at the beginning. Where was your grandfather from in Poland? What was his background?
So he was born in what was then the east of Poland. And the borders of Poland back then were different to the borders now. They were further to the east. And to kind of put it in context, where he was is now actually in Western Ukraine. So that gives you a kind of idea of where it was. Yeah, it was an interesting area and an interesting time because Poland had only recently regained its independence after the First World War. So he would have been one of the first children, I suppose, born into that new Poland. Because it was only around 1920 or so that there'd been a series of battles with Soviets and Ukrainians and so on for the lands around there in Eastern Europe. So he was born in 1924, very soon after that. And it was actually land that had been in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire before the First World War. So very interesting area. And it was a very diverse, multi-ethnic area as well. So there were Poles, there were Ukrainians, there were Catholics, Orthodox Christians, there were Jews as well. And he lived a very kind of rural existence. So he lived in a small village. His father had been given the land for half price because his father had fought in the Polish-Soviet War a few years before. So he'd been given that land for half price. And rightly or wrongly, the Polish government had been encouraging Polish people to move to that region. As I say, it was very multi-ethnic. There were lots of Ukrainians there who tended to be in the countryside, lots of Poles who tended to be in the city. I think the Polish government was just trying to, build security and stability in that area. And rightly or wrongly, they kind of encouraged Poles to move there. So they had a small farm, maybe 100 acres actually, and they grew kind of crops there, wheat, barley, rye, and so on. And they had a few animals, some horses and cows. And yeah, that was his life. They kind of worked the land. They lived off the land. He went to school sometimes, but not that often because they were always being pulled away to plough the land or to harvest the land, or the weather was just bad. Yeah, so it was a very kind of subsistence existence almost around the countryside.
Towards the end of the 30s where people are starting to rearm, do you know if the family felt more threatened by the Russians or the Germans, which is always a peculiar question because everyone says, with the German invasion, but then usually people forget that the Russians followed up. I didn't know if you ever mentioned, before the German invasion, we're actually more afraid of the Russians or more afraid of the Germans.
I think there was a lot of awareness of a potential threat from the Germans and the Russians. There had been peace treaties signed with both countries, but I'm not sure people had a whole lot of faith in those. Obviously, once we got into the 30s and the Germans started invading various places, they were probably seen as more of the immediate threat. As far as I'm aware, some people in Poland felt that the Russians might support them if the Germans came. But I think that was probably a minority view. And I think most people were probably lacked trust towards the Russians as well. But as I say, because once they saw the Germans actually coming into the Austria and Czechoslovakia and so on, they were probably seen as the more immediate threat. In terms of kind of military preparation, I think that was more based around responding to a German invasion. I think the plan had been to withdraw the Polish army east to kind of the border with Romania, where they could maybe hold out and be resupplied and so on. And obviously that would be based upon the Soviets not being aggressive from the east.
So when the Germans invaded in 1939, your family's in the east. How did that immediately affect them? I mean, it's easy to think that the whole of Poland is swept away with the German invasion, but Poland's a massive country, which it would be even bigger then.
Yeah, I think we have this perspective that the Germans came and then, the whole country kind of fell immediately. But that's not what happened. So the Germans invaded on the 1st of September. They were in the west of the country, so they didn't actually come anywhere near where my grandfather and his family were. So things kind of continued as much as they had before in the eastern area of Poland. And as I say, it was just when the Russians came, that was when everything really started to fall apart.
His brother joins the Polish army. Was he conscripted or did he volunteer?
I think he was a volunteer. I'm not sure exactly if it was kind of the formal Polish army or more kind of a home guard type part of the Polish army. But yeah, he joined up, he volunteered. So he was taken away to, again, the east of Poland, where they were hoping to kind of get resupplied and be able to base their fight back against the Germans from. The
family farm is when the Russians invade Poland. They have the secret pact with the Germans, don't they? How does that affect your family on their farm?
Yeah, so that's when their whole life does start to change. So we said the Germans invaded on the 1st of September, and then it was on the 17th of September when the Soviets, the Russians, invaded. And yes, that was when everything really started to change. So soldiers turned up at the farm and they started doing surveys about the size of the farm and the number of people living there. And basically they said, we're not having private property anymore. This all belongs to the Soviet state. And XYZ, this is how much produce, eggs, meat, etc. you're going to provide us with. We're going to come round with a horse and cart each week, and we're going to collect this amount from you. So that was a massive change. And then more broadly within that area of eastern Poland, things changed as well, obviously. So if you went to the local town, which was maybe 5 miles away, suddenly there was nothing left in the shops anymore. A lot of it had been requisitioned by the Red Army or taken back to the Soviet Union. So there wasn't anything in the shops, or you had to queue for hours to get anything out of the shop. There was a lot more tension. There was a lot less stability. So people who had maybe had a grudge against the Polish government before, they now felt that they could act with some impunity to maybe try and take revenge against people. And the Soviets put into positions of power all the people who were kind of on their side, who they trusted or were communist. So the Polish police force, for example, was disbanded, and it was replaced with a militia that was made up of, trusted people, maybe communists and so on. Some of those people had been taken out of prison and then put into those roles. And as I say, just the sense of security, the sense of law and order was less than it had before. And there was just a lot of tension between the different groups, different political persuasions, maybe different ethnic backgrounds as well.
They're ordered off the farm, your family. Is this part of a mass deportation, or were they just picking on certain people who they felt owned land and will just take you from the land because we're having it now?
It was a mass deportation. So if you look at the figures, overall there were 1 million or more Poles deported to the Soviet Union. It happened in a few waves. And one of those waves was in February 1940, which was the one that my grandfather and his family were caught up in. It was all very sudden. So they came in the middle of the night. In his case, they came at 3 o'clock in the morning. They basically said, "You're leaving. You've got half an hour. Gather together all your belongings, and then you're leaving." And they never said where they were going. They just said, "Oh, you're going to be going to another village in Poland." They never said the real destination. So they were given half an hour. They tried as much as they could to gather together some clothes, some blankets, some food. They threw it all into potato sacks, and then they were picked up half an hour later by the Soviets, and they were taken on sledge because it was very cold, middle of winter, so horse and sledge, and they were taken to the train station in the nearest town, and they were basically put on cattle trucks. So it wasn't a proper passenger train with seats or toilets or anything like that. It was basically transport wagons like you would transport livestock in. And they were put on there, and they had the whole carriage to themselves. So there was maybe 6 or 7 of them in the family. All there was inside that carriage was a small stove, but there was no coal or wood or anything to light that stove. They were sent off without knowing where they were going. And it turned out that their end destination was going to be Siberia and the Soviet Gulag.
So are they prisoners in these? I wasn't quite sure quite how much freedom they have. Are they suddenly Soviet citizens, but you're going to live in Siberia? How much freedom do they have in these gulags in Siberia? In, I guess, February, they're arriving in the middle of the winter.
So in terms of being Soviet citizens, there was elections. We can say elections. They were kind of sham elections about Poland becoming part of the Soviet Union. So they probably would be considered Soviet citizens. And then they would have been deported just because they were seen as a threat to the Soviets. You know, there'd been history with the Polish-Soviet wars, and basically they would have been seen as potential troublemakers in that area of the Soviet Union. So they were deported there. In terms of freedoms, very little freedoms. They were sent there to work, basically. If you worked, you would get some food, more food the more that you worked. But you didn't really have any freedoms. I mean, the area would be guarded. It was also in the middle of nowhere. So it wasn't as if you could really easily kind of escape to anywhere. So the camp where they were was near a town called Noshul, which is about 1,000 kilometers to the northeast of Moscow. So really far north, very, very cold winters. And even the journey to get there had been terrible, actually. It had taken them a number of days, maybe even a week. And you can imagine what the conditions would have been like, even just in terms of basic sanitation. You know, there were no toilets. They never stopped at stations. So basically, you know, people were having to go out the side of the wagon when the train was still moving. So just really degrading, horrible situations. They weren't given any food. It was very, very cold. Vulnerable people, old people were already starting to suffer even on that journey, and some were even dying on that journey. And then when they got to the Gulag, things just continued to get even worse. Everyone who was aged over 15 was expected to go out and work. So my grandfather, who was just 15, he had to go out with all the others and work. And it was manual labor, 6 days a week, 12 hours per day, things, felling trees, things like that, that they had to carry out in those freezing temperatures.
There's almost like a veneer of it not being a prison camp, because they keep them as the family unit. They keep them fed to some degree. I mean, they're all starving. They're not getting a calorific intake. It's such a peculiar sort of existence. It's very harsh. Presumably, as you say, a lot of the older folk who are shipped out will have died, so there must be a high casualty rate. But there is a catalyst for change, isn't there? So he's there in 1940. the end. I can't remember when's the German invasion. It's
so that was around 41? June 41, I think. Yeah, so he was there between about February 1940 and June 1941. And as I say, during that time, lots of manual labor. If you wanted to get food, you had to work. And he started off working in the forest, felling trees. And then after a few months, the Soviets asked for some volunteers to come and work in a blacksmith's. And his father was very skilled with practical things, with his hands. So he volunteered to go and work in that blacksmith's, and he took my grandfather and his brother as well. So then they worked there. And that was when they were actually separated from my grandfather's mother and my grandfather's two younger siblings. So they stayed back in the original work camp, and then my grandfather was moved to Noshul, where they worked in this blacksmith's. And that was unfortunately when his younger brother firstly died, and then his mother died as well. Everyone was just so weak. There were diseases going around. And after that, his younger sister, who was the kind of only one left from that small group, she came to live with them. And then, as we said, it was when the Germans invaded in June 1941. Things had been looking hopeless because the Germans had been doing successfully in Europe. The Soviets had been doing successfully as well. It just looked hopeless. No one knew where help was going to come from. But when the Germans invaded in June 1941, the Soviets suddenly started being more friendly to the Poles in the camps. And there was a offer that they were allowed to leave the camps and to go and join a Polish army. The hope from the Soviets was that this Polish army could then help them fight the Germans. So a lot of Poles left the camps to try to find this Polish army, but it wasn't very clear where this army was. Also, a lot of Poles, all of the Poles, didn't really want to fight alongside the Soviets because of what had happened, but they still wanted to take the chance of getting out of the camps and try to find this Polish army. So my grandfather was one of those, and he left with his brother around the July 1941 in search of this Polish army, but nobody knew exactly where it was. They'd heard rumors it was in Kazakhstan, which was slightly to the south. So that's where they tried to head to. But it was...
But that must be thousands of miles away as well.
Yeah, thousands. So they were back on the trains again, back on the cattle wagons. And it was almost as bad as it had been before. There was no food, there was no sanitation. Anytime the train stopped, they would try to gather some food from the fields, which they would often have to eat raw because there was no way to cook it. And they just kept traveling, trying to find more information about this Polish army, where it might be. At one point, my grandfather then got separated from his older brother. So he was then 17, and he'd found himself basically lost and alone in the middle of Kazakhstan with no idea where he should go to try to find this army. So that must have been a really difficult point for him.
What surprises me is that the Soviets allowed them to travel. It's like the Soviets want them to join the army, but we're not going to help you join the army. So but we are going to let you travel. So they just sort of cast adrift across the USSR with no help. Presumably they haven't had a lot of money available to them, and somehow they've got to make their way across thousands of miles of a country that is now at war between whatever on the railways is moving to the front or away from the front or doing... And there's this whole community sort of set adrift looking for a mysterious army that's somewhere in Central Asia that they're not sure quite exists. Where did he find the Polish army eventually? I mean, it amazed me that there is a separate Polish army allowed to form somewhere in Russia, because it sounds a security threat, I would have thought, from the KGB's point of view.
As I say, the aspiration from the Soviet side was probably that the Poles would fight alongside them against the Nazis, but that was heavily resisted. by the Poles. So after losing his brother in Kazakhstan, he picked up a rumor that the Polish army was down in Uzbekistan. So he made his way down there, and he ended up in the city called Tashkent, which is the main city in Uzbekistan. He kind of hoped he might find the army there, but the trail went cold. There wasn't really any more information there. And Tashkent at the time was a huge magnet for refugees from all over the Soviet Union. So there were people from the west of the Soviet Union who were fleeing east to try and escape the Nazis. And a lot of them had come to Tashkent as well. So this was a city that was swollen with refugees, more than 1 million people there. They used to say it was like a leech that had sucked up so much blood, it was ready to burst. My grandfather was stuck there with no money, basically, because his brother had all the money. So he just tried to make his way there, to survive there. At night, he would maybe sleep on the ashes that people had thrown out from their fires to try to stay warm, or he would hide at the railway station, again, to try and stay warm. And eventually he picked up another rumor that the Polish army was a little bit further west in Uzbekistan. So he started making his way there. He worked at a cotton farm on the way. And then he eventually found the Polish army in Uzbekistan. And it was a camp that was in a slightly mountainous area of Uzbekistan. And he got there autumn, early winter 1941. Initially, they didn't want him because he was too young. And my grandfather was desperate to join the army. And the army, in the end, decided they would just fake his age. They were desperate for people to join. There was no birth certificate that anyone could check. So they faked his age, and that's how he joined the army. And he was there over the winter in that camp until spring 1942. So I'd said that up to that point, the Soviets had been hoping the Poles would fight with them, but the Poles had been resistant to that. And it was around spring 1942 that was kind of resolved. So there was an agreement made between the Soviets and the British that would allow the Poles and the Polish army to leave the Soviet Union and join up with the British army down in the Middle East. So what happened then in spring 1942, he was taken by boat over the Caspian Sea down to what was then Persia. And that was when he started to come within, the British sphere of influence. And he was taken from Persia down to Iraq. And then he was put in basically helping process refugees in a camp in Iraq. So there were a lot of Polish refugees coming out of the Soviet Union by that time. And the camp where he was based would help to process them. So give them some food, give them some shelter, new clothes, give them a shower, clean them up, get rid of the lice and all that kind of thing. And then the Polish refugees would move on to another city after 2 or 3 days. And that's where my grandfather was for more than a year.
And it's Iraq, amazingly, bumps into his brother, isn't he?
Yes. So nearby...
Oh, such a coincidence.
Such a coincidence. So nearby where my grandfather was, there was the 5th Division of the Polish Army. And it was just by chance. My grandfather had gone for a walk with a friend one evening down to a nearby river. And he'd seen this figure in the river washing himself that looked familiar. And it turned out it was his brother. So it's remarkable. After all those miles, all those months, to randomly find each other again in the middle of Iraq, just like that.
From Iraq, is he shipped to the UK via India? Every time he seems to go in the wrong direction to come back west again.
So as I say, he was in the camp in Iraq for about a year until the beginning of 1943. And it was around then that the agreement which the Soviets had with the British about allowing the Poles to leave, the Soviets cancelled that agreement. So there were no more Polish refugees coming out of the Soviet Union, no more work to do in the camp where my grandfather was. So that was where the decision was made that he would be taken to the UK. And yes, as you say, he sets off in the opposite direction. So he's taken by ship from the Middle East over to India, and he's in a camp near Bombay for a few weeks, the camp called Dulali. And it's quite funny because when my grandfather started telling me about this camp called Dulali, I thought, that can't be right. That can't be the name of the camp. I thought he'd maybe gone a bit Dulali, but I thought I had to check, and that is exactly the name of the camp.
It's Diwali or something, isn't it? It's a British mispronunciation or a bastardization of or a in joke, isn't it? Of Diwali or Dwalali.
Exactly. Exactly. Because apparently a lot of the British soldiers, when they'd been stationed there, waiting for their ships home, they maybe had to stay for a long time, and it was very hot, and there was mosquitoes and sandflies or so on, and they went a little bit crazy, and that's where the slang term for Dulali comes from. Yeah.
It's great, isn't it? It's just a massive transit camp. Yeah.
So from there, he was taken again by ship to the UK via South Africa, and it was a ship called the Mariposa. It was an American ship. It had originally been a passenger ship, one of the most glamorous passenger ships on the sea, but it had been requisitioned by the US for military means. And they were on that for weeks and weeks. It was interesting because they sailed without any protection, no naval protection, because the ship was supposed to be one of the fastest on the ocean that could outrun any of the Japanese ships or submarines. But I think people were still a bit apprehensive about that. So they were on the ship with lots of other soldiers, not just Poles, but also Americans and other countries. They slept in bunks that were 4 high, and they used to gamble. So they used to play dice, gambling on the number that they thought would come up. And then my grandfather won big one day on the dice. He won, I think, $30 or $40, which was, well, a lot of money in those days. So to keep it safe, he wrapped it in his uniform and then put it under his pillow at night. And then when he woke up in the morning, he discovered someone had cut a hole in his mattress and then stolen the money while he was sleeping.
Incredible story, isn't it? Someone knew it was there. Now he arrives in Scotland. Is that where a lot of the Polish army arrived in Britain? I wasn't quite sure where. Well, when you think of Britain, the Americans are in certain parts, the British are in certain parts, and the Canadians are in certain parts. And it suddenly occurred to me that I was slightly embarrassed to think, I'm not sure where the Poles tended to be based. I mean, there's probably 1 or 2 bases where they centralised. Was that the home of the Polish army in Britain?
I suppose we have to maybe take a step back and say some of the Poles were in Britain, but some of the Poles were, like my grandfather's brother, they had been based in the Middle East, and they took a different route. So they came through Egypt, Palestine, and then they fought up through Italy at battles like Monte Cassino. But yes, a number of Poles came to the UK. So my grandfather joined the Parachute Brigade.
Was that volunteer, or was he sort of told he was joining the Parachute Brigade?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the first day they arrived, a captain from the Parachute Brigade came to them and basically told them they were going to be joining the Parachute Brigade. But my granddad actually then said he wanted to join the Air Force. I think he'd always fancied being an air gunner in the Air Force. But the parachute captain was desperate to have them join the brigade. So, he took them out to show them the parachute and all sorts of things. Nobody from the Air Force came to talk to them. So in the end, they all joined the Parachute Brigade. I'm not sure they had a lot of choice about refusing it, to be honest. I'm sure there was all sorts of pressure coming from various sides. But yeah, that's what he did. And they were based in Fife in Scotland, around towns like Leven and Ely and Earl's Ferry. And that was where they would get trained up to be the paratroopers.
Did they go through the regular parachute training like the British units? Did they get sent down to Ringway and Manchester? Is this a Polish unit in the British Army or a separate Polish unit of its own right, but following British doctrine and training?
So initially it was sold to them as being an independent Polish unit. So they were told that the function of this brigade was to help liberate Poland. So they would be dropped into Poland, dropped into Warsaw when the timing was right. They would help with an uprising against the Germans, and they would help to liberate Poland. And they were told that they were independent of British command. And that certainly was the case initially. Things did change later, as we'll see. And then in terms of the training, so they eventually went down to Ringway in Manchester, but the first part of their training was in Fife. They had their own Polish Brigade training. So the very first part was at a place called Largo House. And it was a big, almost like a stately home. And in the grounds of that, they'd set up an assault course where, you'd climb ropes, or you would swing between the trees, or you would practice jumping off high objects and landing and things like that. And it was nicknamed the Monkey Grove because they felt they were like monkeys swinging between the trees. And they did that for a week or so. And then they were taken to the Parachute Tower, which was also nearby. And this was about 100-foot high metal structure. And you'd climb to the top and you would be put into a parachute harness. And the parachute would be already open above you, but it was just for show, really, because it couldn't slow you down much over 100 feet. And then the parachute harness was attached to a cable that the captain could control. So he would let you down slowly at first, and then faster and faster as you got used to it. And then the other part of their training up in Fife, they were taken to, it was almost like a disused factory. And inside one of the big rooms there, they'd set up balance beams or narrow ledges that they had to practice walking along. So they'd be maybe 4 to 6 inches wide, either against the wall or in the middle of the room, and a good height, maybe 4 meters, 5 meters. And they had to practice doing that. And the captain would set them off with the reassuring words that if you fall, it's your neck. So they had to do that without any safety equipment. And then once they'd done that for a few weeks, and if they'd met all expectations, that's when they were sent down to Ringway in Manchester.
He rang the bell, didn't he? Tell me about it, because it's a great phrase. I've just been reading about aircraft, parachute carrier aircraft. So explain this, because I think for many people listening, they'll be amused and horrified.
Yes. So this was the next part of the paratrooper training. So they were firstly taken up by balloon. So it was kind of like a barrage balloon, and it took them up to about 800 feet, and then they would have to jump out, and the parachute would automatically open and let them down. And the way they jumped out, there was a hole in the floor. So it was maybe a few feet deep, a few feet wide, and you had to be quite careful when you dropped through this hole so that you didn't hit your head or any other part of your body on the hole. You had to kind of stand up straight and not push yourself too far forward, because then you'd hit yourself on the other side. And that was called ringing the bell. So if you basically push yourself too far forward and you hit your head on the side of this hole, that was called ringing the bell. And that happened to my grandfather on the next step. So after the balloon, they were taking up in the Whitley bomber, which by all accounts was a horrible aircraft. It was cramped, it was dark, not very pleasant. And then you had to, again, jump out through this hole in the bottom of the aircraft. So my grandfather did that. I guess with all the adrenaline rushing through him, he didn't notice when he initially did it. But then once he'd landed on the ground, he noticed all this blood dropping off him, and he'd rung the bell. He'd whacked his nose on the side of the hole, and it all started bleeding.
He'd thrown himself out of the plane. It is quite a remarkable story. How did the Poles find life in Britain? Certainly from your grandfather's point of view, very different from he's come a long way from his gulag. But did they just slip into Scottish society, or were they kept apart?
Well, there was, I guess, mixed feelings. So there was definitely lots of opportunities for integration and socializing. There was local dances, which they went to with country music and Scottish country dancing and so on. And the Poles would go there, and some of the local ladies would go there as well. And the Poles were very popular with some of the local ladies. They brought maybe a sense of style that was new to the East Neuk of Fife in Scotland. You know, they would maybe kiss the lady's hand, or they would click their heels together. This wasn't something that had been seen before in the East Neuk, I don't think. So they were very popular with some of the ladies, but there was also some resistance from other people. So some of the men were maybe a bit jealous, and also there was quite a lot of communism in those days with the men in the factories, and they were reluctant to believe what the Poles said had happened to them at the hands of the Soviets. And in fact, you know, they wouldn't allow Poles to come to some of the dances that they organized, the men in the factories. And there was also a religious aspect to it as well. Back in those days in Scotland, Church of Scotland, quite strong Protestant, wasn't necessarily too keen on, you know, their daughters marrying a Catholic Polish paratrooper, for example. So there was probably mixed feelings. But I think overall, I think the Polish felt very happy to be in Scotland, very well accepted. They blended in nicely and with the local communities, and were, you know, well respected by those local communities. And it's evidenced by the fact that after the war, so many of them decided to stay in that area as well.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Nicholas Kinloch about his grandfather's remarkable wartime experience. So they missed D-Day. Is the Polish Parachute Brigade part of the 6th Airborne Division, isn't it?
Yes. So
I've got that right. Before anyone shoots me down. So that will be Market Garden.
So they were in Market Garden. As you say, they weren't involved in D-Day. By that point, they had been brought down to the southeast of England. So they were based around Ely, Peterborough, Stamford, that kind of area by then. And there'd been all sorts of rumours through early, middle 1944 about what kind of actions they might be involved in. So they were kind of on a hair trigger all the time about when they might go. But they weren't involved in D-Day. It was in the September 1944, Operation Market Garden and Arnhem, where they would be involved. And that was, again, a massive action, massive operation. There was going to be 35,000 dropped behind enemy lines in the Netherlands to try and seize these key bridges over the River Rhine, and then allow the land forces of the Allies to kind of quickly get across those bridges and into Germany.
Now he's due to drop, I've got this right, on day 3. So they drop on day 3, but at the last minute the drop zone is changed. What is their mission? What is they meant to achieve on day 3? Because obviously there's quite a lot of fighting going on. I was saying, how is their drop? Because changing anything at last minute is never great, and parachute drops are notorious for going wrong to start with. So it doesn't bode well for this.
So the initial goal, they were to be dropped the furthest behind enemy lines. So they were to be dropped at Arnhem, and their role was to support the British paratroopers who were also being dropped there in order to seize and hold the bridge over the river at Arnhem. And as you say, originally meant to be dropped on the 3rd day, so that would be the 19th. As I understand it, there were just so many troops that they didn't have enough aircraft to drop everyone at the same time, so they had to spread it over 3 days. So they were scheduled to be dropped on the 3rd day. But what actually happened was they were delayed even more than that because the weather was terrible. So there was too much fog on that day. Then the next day they came back again, still too much fog. So it was only the day after that, so that would have been the 21st, I think, when they were actually dropped. So already 2 days delayed. And it was kind of halfway over that they discovered that the drop zone had been changed because the original drop zone was no longer safe. So they were then to be dropped near a small village called Driel. And their objective was, once they landed, to kind of secure the area and then to try and support the British paratroopers. And the British paratroopers were over the other side of the River Rhine in an area called Oosterbeek, where they were kind of holed up and facing a lot of resistance. The British paratroopers had tried to take and hold the bridge over Arnhem, but they hadn't been able to. So they'd retreated to this area in Oosterbeek. And yes, under heavy attack from the Germans, were trying to hold that for as long as possible.
They land on the south bank of the Rhine, I think, isn't it? I know what was surprised was how quickly they actually meet up with 30 Corps, who are, in theory, coming to relieve them at Arnhem. But they have to then make a crossing across the Rhine. The parachutists, it's almost like you might be better off landing on the north bank rather than the south bank. How's his crossing? Because this is, whilst the bank they're crossing to is held by the British, it isn't a paused crossing, is it? The Germans are firing at them, I think, aren't they?
Yes, so they came under heavy fire, and there were a number of attempts to get them across the river. So some paratroopers tried to get across on that first day that they landed. They tried to improvise some way to get across, but were unsuccessful. Then they tried again on the second night, again improvising a cable system and some dinghies. Maybe 50 got across that second night. And then my grandfather, so I think we're on to the 23rd of September now, he was scheduled to go across on that third night. And yes, it's very, very difficult crossing. They were under fire from the Germans, machine guns, trying to make their way across the river. Very strong current, not making very quick progress. So basically like sitting ducks there while they're trying to make their way across. Some of them had oars, some didn't, so they try and paddle with the butt of their rifle. My granddad was one of the lucky ones that managed to get across, but others were not so lucky. They were shot or their boat was sunk, and then with the heavy equipment that they were wearing, they didn't have much chance to kind of stay above the water. But my grandfather did manage to get across. Then they spent the night near that landing zone. Somehow he managed to fall asleep for a few hours. I'm not sure how. And then the next morning, they rendezvoused and met up with the British paratroopers over there.
Who've now been out on a limb for, well, the Poles were supposed to be helping them on day 3. They arrived 2 days later. They've been trying to cross the river for 3 days. It's quite a long time later. What position do they find themselves in when they meet up with the British? What do the British need them to do? Is there still any hope of being able to achieve their objective?
The British were in a very difficult situation. They were low on supplies, food, ammunition, everything, basically. They were up against much higher resistance than had been expected. You know, they hadn't expected tanks and so on. So they were finding it very difficult. At that point, I think there was still a hope that they could maybe do enough to give time for 30 Corps to get up and then maybe help them get across the river. So it was still a little bit touch and go, we can say, on that day, which was the 24th. And my grandfather, with the section that he was in, they were sent forward of the lines, actually, to defend a house that was a bit further up. So they kind of set themselves up in this house to defend the area and look out for Germans. And that didn't end out well. That ended up, his captain was shot. One of his friends was shot as well by a sniper through the window. And they ended up spending the night there. The Germans had been playing some tricks to try and lure them out. So, for example, a tank came up along the street, and when the person came out of the tank, he was speaking in English and trying to pretend he was in in the British Army to get them to come out. So very stressful, difficult situation. And then it obviously became clear to everyone involved that the situation just wasn't tenable. So eventually the order came through that they were going to withdraw and they were going to retreat back over the River Rhine.
As if going one way wasn't easy, he's now having to do it again, 24 hours later, 36 hours later?
Something like that, yes. So I think it was maybe the 25th then when the order came through that they were going to retreat. And it was horrible weather that evening by all accounts. It was heavy rain. And they were taken down to the riverbank to make this crossing back over again. And they already knew what a horrible crossing it was. And were worried about being fired upon and everything. And when they got to the riverside, there were hundreds of other paratroopers there, all waiting for the boats to take them back across. And there were a few boats, and they were doing their best. They were going back and forth all night, but it was becoming clear that there weren't enough boats to get everyone back across the river. And when dawn started to come, my grandfather still hadn't managed to get into a boat. And they stopped the crossings once the sun came up because they knew it'd be too dangerous with the Germans firing on them. So at that point, my granddad was then stuck, stranded behind enemy lines.
And the British completely withdrawn. So what's he? I mean, I guess his options are to just go on the run or give himself up.
Yes, he initially wondered whether he could swim the river. If he maybe took off all his equipment, he could maybe try and swim the river. But it's very wide, the river there, and the current's very strong. So he decided not to. And around that area, there'd been a number of makeshift first aid medical houses set up. So they'd kind of taken over local people's homes and they'd turned them into first aid centres. And they would put all the wounded in there. So not just British, but also Germans and some of the Dutch locals, they'd be all put in there. And my granddad decided that he would make his way to one of these houses. He thought that would be the best option. So he went there and he decided he'd try to get rid of as much equipment as he could. He thought that might make him a bit safer. So he threw away his arms. He also threw away his army book. He was very worried that if the Germans knew he was Polish, they might treat him differently and treat him worse than British prisoners of war. So he tried to get rid of all those means of identification. He stayed the night in that first aid house. And then the next morning, some Germans came round. So the Germans knew that there were some paratroopers that hadn't managed to get back across the river. And they were basically going around trying to round them up. And they rounded my grandfather up and they got a group of maybe 20 of them. And again, it wasn't clear what was going to happen here. One of the Germans came up to my grandfather and basically told another German to shoot him. And fortunately for my grandfather, the other German refused. But it was a very dicey touch and go situation. And then they marched the paratroopers that they'd captured through the streets from Oosterbeek over to Arnhem. And my grandfather said you could see, all the wounded or all the dead just piled at the side of the road or even on the road with tanks just driving across the bodies. Or there was one paratrooper that had landed on power lines and his body was all charred and black. So just a horrible situation. And they marched them to another medical building, kind of makeshift hospital near Arnhem. And my grandfather was there for a few days and he ended up helping the doctor and the nurses there with some of the operations and taking care of the patients. And each day, the Germans would come and they would take away all the wounded or all the prisoners, I guess, to be interrogated or to prisoner of war camps or so on. But every day my granddad would hide from them. So he would hide in the toilets so they wouldn't take him away. And he was there for a few days. But then the doctor came to him one day and said, today's your last day. You need to escape because the Germans are going to be closing down this whole facility and taking everyone away. So you can't stay here anymore. And then my grandfather was wondering again, what should I do? Should I try to get back to the river, get across? What should I do? And one of the nurses came up, a male nurse, and he told my grandfather that he was in the Dutch underground and that if he wanted, he could help my grandfather to escape. So he provided my grandfather with some civilian clothes. And he said, right, put these on. I've got some bikes for us. The place was surrounded with guards. But he said, I'm going to speak Dutch to you on the way out. You don't say anything, but I'll speak Dutch to you. And we're just going to cycle out straight past these guards. And that's what they did.
You can picture the scene in a movie, can't you? So well. Just pretend to be Dutch. I'll speak to you, some sort of 70s sort of war film. It's such a remarkable act of bravery, I guess, from the Dutch resistance and a faith your father had just to put his life in the guy's hands as he literally walked them out of being a prisoner of war, and he's on the run. He's on the run for 5 weeks, aided by the Dutch, which is incredible because Holland must have been crawling with Germans rounding up paratroopers.
Yes, remarkable. And as you say, everyone was incredibly brave. You know, the Dutch underground to put themselves at risk to do that. And they sheltered him in various houses. So they would kind of move him around when they felt the net was getting too tight, or they would hide him in the forest as well. On one occasion, the net did tighten very much, and the situation that everyone had been fearing occurred. So my grandfather had been hidden along with 2 other paratroopers in a local house, and they'd been staying up in the attic. And then one day they heard footsteps outside and they heard German voices. It was what they'd always feared, that someone would come, because the Germans knew that there were paratroopers being hidden. They were going around searching houses and so on. So they were in a desperate situation. They were in this attic with the Germans starting to come inside the home, and they had to try and hide themselves. And in the attic, there was quite a lot of junk. So one of the paratroopers hid himself in a corner behind the junk, and one of the other paratroopers, he managed to kind of wedge himself behind the wardrobe. But there wasn't many other places where my grandfather could go. So in desperation, he saw this old pram and he saw this old overcoat, and he threw the overcoat over the pram, and then he crouched underneath. So the coat didn't quite come to the floor. It was maybe 6 inches from the floor. And he could see, as the Germans came up the stairs and into the attic, he could see them. And obviously trying to stay as quiet as possible, hoping that the Germans will leave quickly. But the Germans didn't leave quickly. They actually sat down then on the bed. They lit up a cigarette, started smoking, and then they started talking about their families and asking whether, the pair of boots that's over there, whether that would be good for his sister or not. And my grandfather all the time is just hoping they'll leave us as soon as possible. And fortunately, the Germans never found them. After maybe 10 minutes or so, they left without discovering them. And after that, they were taken to another house and then on to the forest. So my granddad was hidden in the forest for about a week. They dug a little trench in the forest, they lined it with straw, and then they made a roof out of sticks and bracken. And a local policeman would come every couple of days to bring him water or bread or soup, things like that. And it was after about 5 weeks, the Dutch resistance then came to them and said, okay, we've got a plan. We're going to try and make an escape back across the river to the Allied side.
Incredible. So how did they get them back with it? Because I find this incredible. One would have thought the Germans have got the banks lined with troops How did the Dutch get them back across without being seen?
So one of the men in the Dutch underground, he ran a transport company. And I think he did various jobs for the Red Cross. So he had a lorry that was painted like a Red Cross lorry. And the plan was they would hide under a tarpaulin in the back of this lorry. And basically they would just try and brass neck drive through the German lines. They'd timed it for that day, I think for a couple of reasons. So the Germans had demanded the local Dutch people in the area evacuate the homes. So there was going to be a lot of other traffic on the road at that time. And I think they hoped that would kind of disguise what they were doing. And they'd also set up a plan where women from the Dutch underground would be stationed every few miles along the road with bicycles. And they would signal if there was a problem by pretending to fix their bicycle. So this was the plan. And they were given some supplies, some Sten guns and uniforms and so on. And they just brass-necked tried to drive their way through the German lines. On one occasion, my grandfather's truck started to slow down and he could hear tanks coming along the road from the other direction. They thought they were going to be stopped. They thought they might have to try and fight their way out of the situation. But for whatever reason, they weren't stopped. The truck sped up again and they kept on their way. And the truck drove them as close as possible as it could to the river. But it was still a few kilometers that they then had to walk. So they were split up into smaller groups and they were led single file through the forest towards the river, trying to be as quiet as they could. If they came to any open spaces like a road, they'd kind of crawl across on their stomachs. And then after a few hours of this, they got to the river. And fortunately, there were no Germans there at the river. And there were some boats waiting for them with an American paratrooper inside just for protection in case. And my granddad jumped in one of the boats with one of the other paratroopers. And by this point, he was just desperate to get across. And he was rowing so hard that he told me he was almost making the boat go in circles because he was so desperate to get back across.
So when they get back across, what happens to them? Is he just returned to unit and is that their last action, or is that sort of him done?
Yeah, pretty much done. So they were taken for a debrief and then they were taken back to southeast of England. My granddad then got actually punishment for not having saluted an officer before they left. So that was his reward.
He's not quite the returning hero.
So he got 7 days CB, and then he was taken up back up to Scotland after that. But that was the last action that he saw, that the whole brigade saw. They'd taken so many casualties that they never saw any more action in the war.
At the end of the war, what's his status? Because Stalin wants the Poles back, doesn't he? And the British, up to a point, send some back. And I'm not sure how those that managed to remain in Britain managed to not be sent back. I
don't remember my grandfather ever talking about pressure to go back to Poland. By that point, he'd met my grandmother.
He would technically be in the Polish army, though, not the British army, wouldn't he?
Yes, although just before Operation Market Garden, the Polish Brigade had become part of the British Army. So they were part of that kind of command structure by then. But he'd really settled in Scotland by that point. As I say, he'd met my grandmother. They had a son. They got married. My grandfather continued for a couple of years after the war. He was with the British Army over the Rhine. So he was over in Germany helping to look after some of the refugees there and so on. And then he got naturalized as a British citizen after that. I mean, he was adamant he didn't want to go back to Poland with all the changes and difficulty there. And as I say, I don't recall him ever saying there was ever any pressure on him to do so. Maybe that was because he had settled with my grandmother and had started a family by that point. But yeah, he settled and he stayed in Fife near St Andrews.
how many of the family survived the war? I mean, there's Billy in the British Army. I think he survives the war, doesn't he?
Yes, he was in the part of the Polish army that came up through Italy. So he fought in Monte Cassino, and then he stayed in the UK. He was in the Isle of Wight. And then his father and younger sister, who he'd left in Siberia, after the war, they were released and they went back to Poland. But obviously, with the borders changing, where they had lived was no longer in Poland. It was then in Soviet Union. So they were given a house in Western Poland, in what had used to be Germany. So they moved there. And then my grandfather also had an older sister and an older brother who had not been taken to Siberia. For example, his older sister had been married to a local Ukrainian man. So I think that was the reason she wasn't taken. But then when the Germans had invaded Poland, the Germans had taken his older sister and older brother to do work for them. But then after the war, their situation was similar. One of them was given land again in Western Poland, and the older brother, he moved to a different part of Poland.
It's incredible, isn't it, how one family can be scattered after the war.
And my grandfather, he did a lot of research through the Red Cross to try and track them down. He'd never really saw them that much since then. He met his father, one more time during the Cold War in 1967. He drove all the way from Scotland to Poland, and he met his father there. And that was the last time he saw his father. And he saw his younger sister and an older sister then as well. And then we went back to Poland one more time after that, and they came to visit us once. But that was really, it was very difficult during the Cold War to see each other, unfortunately.
I guess it just depends on how cold the Cold War is, whether you can actually make the trip or not. As it warms up, sometimes you had access, then you didn't have access. Absolutely incredible. Which part, the original family farm, which country does it lie in now?
So it now lies in Ukraine, Western Ukraine. And if you look it up on the map, the nearest big city is a place called Tarnopol, which you can find on most maps. But as I say, they were in a small village called Obranchuvka, which was maybe 10 miles, 15 miles away from that city.
Well, it's interesting how those borders have moved through the 20th century. Nicholas, thank you for your time and sharing your grandfather's story. Loyal listener, if you would like to read Stanislaw Kulik's full story, his memoir is From the Soviet Gulag to Arnhem, a Polish paratrooper's epic wartime journey. Well, that is all for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please consider becoming a patron of the podcast. The full details are at patreon.com/WW2podcast. Patrons get a custom RSS feed, which gives them advert-free listening and extras appearing magically in their podcast feed. So that is patreon.com/WW2podcast. And it is a big thank you to all those who have already signed up to support the show. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.